We'll start with a brief introduction. My name is Matt Barker. I'm co-founder and president of Jetstack, and I'm also helping with Open UK as entrepreneur in residence to look at how we can help encourage and foster open source businesses in the UK. Amanda, who runs Open UK, asked me to make sure everyone knows that Open UK is the UK organization for open technology, and that covers open source software, open hardware, and open data. And our purpose is UK leadership and international collaboration in open technology. As part of my role last year, I started to do a lot of research into how we can help people that were interested in starting businesses in this space succeed. And through a lot of research and conversations with potential founders, I found that one of the things that they were struggling with was just a lack of educational understanding on some particular areas that are quite personal or specific to starting an open source business. And this Future Founders program has been set up to try and find the experts that can help tackle some of those difficult questions. And each week we're going to be covering a new topic. This is the first topic that we're going to be covering. So welcome to our first session. And the topic is why you should found an open source business at all. And what we're trying to achieve, what we really want to do is help people to understand these areas and try and take away some of the myths that may be associated with some of these topics. And today we want people to step away with an understanding of why they might want to start an open source business, some of the factors that they might need to consider in that, and help them to understand what they're getting themselves in for, and also possibly some of the issues that they might be able to avoid with some of the advice that the panelists can give. We're also looking for people to join the mentorship program. A number of the people that are going to be joining the Future Founder sessions are people that have helped me with my personal business journey and starting a company in the space. And that's where we want to give additional one-to-one help with founders that are in the UK that might need the help. So if there are any of you that are out there that are interested in starting an open source business, please do go to openuk.uk/founders forum, and you can actually apply for that program there, and you can keep track of all the various sessions that we're going to be running over the next 10 weeks or so. So on that note, I'd like to move over to give an introduction to the panelist. And I'll start with Alexis Richardson, no less. He's the founder and CEO of Weaveworks, who are the people who are famous for being behind the GitOps movement, and they're a provider of commercial and open source solutions for Kubernetes. So I got to know him a long time ago when he was founder of Rabbit Technologies, and he had a successful exit to VMware off the back of their very successful open source project, RabbitMQ, which is a message broker. At VMware, he held various business roles at Pivotal and in and around the cloud application platform and the Spring framework. There's not much he doesn't know about the open source startup ecosystem. He's helped me many times over the years with advice around business models and various crazy ideas that I had at the time and various introductions. So Alexis, big welcome to you. We've also got Liz Rice. Hi, Liz. Liz is the Chief Open Source Officer at Isovalent, the cloud native networking security experts behind Cilium and eBPF. Liz has done an incredible amount for the open source ecosystem over the years, including as chair for the CNCF Technical Oversight Committee, previous co-chair of KubeCon and Cloud Native Con, and was also the founder and CEO of her own company in the space, Microscaling Systems, back in the early days of the container and Kubernetes ecosystem. We worked very closely together a number of times. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And we also have David Mitten. David is the co-founder and CEO of Console, which is a weekly email digest of the best tools and beta releases for developers. He's also expert in residence at Seedcamp and previous co-founder and CEO of Server Density, which is a software as a service infrastructure monitoring company based on open source monitoring agent and custom time series database. They had a successful exit to StackPath, where he became VP of product engineering. He was also personally my first ever customer at Ubuntu back when I was in open source software sales, and then at MongoDB. He's also an angel investor and an early stage open source. He's an angel investor in early stage open source startups. So yeah, if there's any of you out there, I'll give you his contact details afterwards. What I'd like to start the session off with is just a kind of a very easy opening question, really, which is how did panelists actually get into open source software and into the ecosystem? Um, I'll start with you, David. Be interested to hear a bit more about that.
The very first time was probably going back into maybe 2005, 2006, when I had a book that told me how to install Red Hat Linux from a CD. I'm not sure that really counts. So I'll talk about the actually writing open source software, which was the creation of the monitoring agent for server density. And that was designed to be installed onto your server, collect stats like disk usage and tie into databases, and then send it back to server density as a service. And I wrote that monitoring agent as an open source project because I felt when I was installing things onto my own servers, I wanted at least the opportunity to be able to review the source code and see what was actually going on. Most people probably don't do that in reality, but the ability to do it, I think, was an important philosophical decision at that point.
And when you started building that or writing that code, in your head, were you actually thinking about starting a business around the code itself, or did that come later?
That came later, but by later, I mean a month or two later.
Okay.
I wrote the agent as a project to learn Python. And if you go back to the original source code, you can see a lot of references to Stack Overflow, which was still really young at that point. It was only probably 2 years old. And just learning how to write the code that needed to inspect the different systems on the server was a way of me learning how to write Python.
Fantastic. Is that code still being used?
Well, it became the Datadog monitoring agent because
Okay,
it was
so
open source.
yes.
Datadog is probably a 40 or $50 billion business now. They forked the agent because it was open source. Although they have now deprecated that Python version and rewritten it all in Go, but I'm sure there are still many hundreds of thousands of servers that are still running some part of that code at least.
I think there'll be plenty of learnings to discuss at various stages through this discussion. So thanks, David. Liz, how did you get into open source?
So I was pretty late to the party, I would say. I spent a good chunk of my early career working on proprietary software. And I would say that the company that I started with, certainly in those days, had a very sort of suspicious attitude to open source. Then kind of fast forward to maybe the first startup that I co-founded, and we were using some open source components and, contributing some fixes back and just sort of starting to dip our toes in the open source world. But I would say it wasn't until I was really getting involved in containers, the whole cloud native ecosystem, that I started to see businesses, giving away essentially the core technology and doing that open source and seeing how powerful that was. And it started to inspire me about how you could use open source to engage with communities and get feedback from communities and all the kind of powerful things that just are not open to you if you're keeping your software behind closed doors. So I would say that whole container cloud native community was really eye-opening for me.
Great. And you mentioned that you were somewhat suspicious of open source before that. What led to that suspicion?
This is going back to the 90s,
Okay.
And I think that if you were certainly in those days, there was much less sort of collaboration on the internet for a start. And the idea that a bunch of people were going to be able to self-organize and do good engineering, it made sense that talented individuals would be able to write good software, but I couldn't really imagine, it wasn't until I saw it happening that I could imagine groups of people self-organizing into actually really good engineering practices. Not all open source is good engineering practices, but it is possible. So that's.
You just reminded me, I had a very similar experience because I was at university doing a change, complexity, and innovation course as part of my business degree, and I learned about Linux then, and they showed pictures of the early Linux user groups, and I was like, "There's no way those guys are going to be able to create an operating system that's going to compete with Microsoft Windows." And it just honestly, it just didn't compute in my head that it could be realistic. And yeah, I had a similar like epiphany, I guess, like early days joining Canonical and seeing just the power of the Ubuntu community and like what that did, and you know, and how David actually at the time was using it in his business. So yeah, it's like interesting like to hear that, Liz. Thanks. Alexis, over to you. How did you get into open source?
So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess like everybody else, I discovered Linux first. We installed it on the university computers in 1994 when it was a pile of floppy disks, not a CD-ROM.
Were you successful?
Took several hours,
Yeah.
if not days. Then I went into finance, and then after that decided to start a technology company. And we had a team of engineers in Finland, and a company was called Metalogic. And the investors in Finland that we spoke to had also made an investment in a company called MySQL AB. So my Finnish company was called Metalogic Oy, which is the Finnish for company. MySQL AB was actually originally a Finnish team, people working on MySQL, and we were sitting around talking about our product, which was a Java cache that would sit in front of a database and provide applications, what we call now an application server. And somebody said, well, this might work quite well with MySQL database. They've got a lot of adoption. We could probably find some customers if we offered a bundle of our product with theirs. And I said, well, we're sharing investors. So I'll ask our investors to put us in touch. This is in 2001 or 2 or thereabouts. And I spoke to this person called Martin Mikos, and he said, well, we would love to work with you. This sounds great. We'd love to have it. I love the idea of an application service cache in front of MySQL database. This sounds like a really good idea. Which part of your technology are you going to open source so we can, you know, bundle it? And I went back to the Finns and said, well, he's really excited about doing something with us. We're going to make some of our software open source. And they said, you must be joking. Are you completely crazy? You know, giving away all this technology that we spent years and years building. Why would we do that? And it was clear that conversation wasn't going to be successful. But I sort of sowed some seeds, and a year or two later, I'd met some advisors to Metalogic, in particular a person called Steve Ross Talbot, who'd founded a company called Spiritsoft, where a few interesting people had worked, including Ross Mason, who went on to found MuleSoft. Ross had just started the Mule project, which is an open source add-on. So Spiritsoft did a messaging product called, I think it was called Spirit MQ. And they had some ideas about value-added services on top. And Ross had been working with them and decided to do his own tool bag for fixing integration problems, which was the Mule. And he had a company called SymphonySoft, which he used for billing his own work, which, by the way, is one of the main reasons people start an open source company. That's actually how JBoss got started as well. They just wanted to have a consolidated billing mechanism for people working on JBoss. And they had this concept of professional open source. That's what we used to talk about at the time, the idea that you could make money by doing consulting while working on an open source project. And the way that worked was that you would engage customers, use the open source project, and get paid to do one-off solutions for the customers that use the project, and that use that to drive it forward. This is before anyone thought of writing a support contract. And you know, even the MySQL business model was didn't exist at the time, and Red Hat certainly hadn't figured out RHEL either.
Yeah.
So through Steve, I met Ross. I also met a gentleman called James Strachan, who has done loads of interesting projects, is currently at CloudBees doing Jenkins X. James had written ActiveMQ, which was typically of James, an open source version of the product he'd worked on as his previous employer. So that was a message queue as well. And James was very, very encouraging indeed about the idea that this is going to be important. And he said, you should also meet some of the other people working on other Java projects, including Spring, which is Rod Johnson and people like that, Rob Harrop and so on. And as I spoke to all of these people, I realized that what they had that we didn't have with our closed source startup was a really easy way for customers to use their product without having to go through multiple meetings, fly places, get people together, talk about pricing, which is something we knew nothing about, and generally get going. And it just seemed very, very, very tempting to have that as a way of connecting with customers rather than putting all these obstacles in their way. So that was when I realized that we should do that as the next project was going to be like this for me back in 2004.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you met some incredible people there very early in the ecosystem. You also mentioned something that I find that we really probably should cover as part of this discussion, and that is for people who are actually working on proprietary technology and whether they should be thinking about open sourcing parts of that, or maybe changing their attitude to open source around it. Obviously, I also heard Finland and all these names. Did you actually, and Linux, did you actually get to meet Linus in Finland at the time or not?
No, we very, very rarely talked about him. Nobody cared about that. We used to go and have meetings with companies like Accenture, and they would talk about WebLogic and things like that a lot. Nobody was interested in Linux. I did sit next to him at breakfast once a few years later, but he didn't talk to me.
He's regretting that now, I'm sure.
Well, I think there is a certain sort of, Finnish taciturnity that you may be aware of.
Yeah. So coming, and I think, Alexis, you've kind of explored a few of the areas there, but obviously when it comes to, it sounds like people kind of got into open source somewhat naturally, and it was maybe by product of some like lucky breaks or chances to sort of to get involved. But when was the decision to actually start a business based on top of open source software, and actually what were the major benefits? Like what drove that decision? And David, I'll come back to you, because I know that you that's the route that you took.
Probably two parts to that question. I think the first, an easy one to answer, is that pretty much every business is built on top of open source today, because all of the underlying components are probably, or many of them are probably, open source. Just visiting a website, you're likely interacting with multiple open source pieces. But I think what you're really getting at is deciding to start a business on top of an open source product. And for me, with server density, the monitoring agent was open source because that's what our customers were installing onto their systems. But where the value was in what we did with that data. We wanted the monitoring agent to be open source because people want to be able to inspect the code in theory, but also we wanted people to be able to write integrations really easily. We could build integrations into common software that was installed onto the servers, but there are so many pieces of infrastructure that are being run out there that it would be impossible for us to cover everything. And so we wanted it to be easy for people to do that. And where the business value was and what we were charging for was the storage of the monitoring data, the visualization of it, and making sure alerts got delivered when stuff broke. And really, that's what people want to be paying money for, to ensure they don't have to run their own monitoring. Certainly at that point in the industry, in 2009, 2010, very early in SaaS and very early in the monitoring ecosystem, which has changed significantly over the last decade. There are now many open source projects, many commercial products do all this. But back in 2009, there were very few tools that could do this for you.
And just out of interest, did you were you selling those individual pieces of value as individual features, or was it fully wrapped in some kind of software as a service that you'd platform that you'd envisaged on top of the open source that you were interaction with?
They came together, so one wouldn't work without the other, and the pricing model was based on the number of servers that you installed the agent onto. Later on, we added different packages to allow you to get different features, and that changed the price per server. But it was always based on that individual unit, how many servers you installed the agent on. Which I suppose you were very familiar with at that point with the Ubuntu licensing. You just charge per server, because that was a pretty good proxy for how successful the business might be. More servers probably got more customers, so you can probably pay more money for it.
Yeah, and obviously you mentioned when you were last talking about the fact that Datadog had actually forked that work that you'd done. Were you aware of the fact that that could happen, and that might happen at the time? And were you trying to protect against that in the way that you were thinking about actually building your business, or did you just accept that as a possible consequence of building based on open source software?
I didn't think about it at the time, and I didn't expect it to happen. just because I hadn't seen anything like that before, partly because I didn't really know much about the industry, but also partly because there aren't that many examples, or there weren't that many examples of projects at the time. Now it's fairly widespread, and there are plenty of examples, even just recently, with very large open source companies that are having their products forked by very large competitors and developing alternatives because they don't agree with the direction of the project. But we later reforked the Datadog agent because we were a smaller company. We let them do a lot of the engineering work, and then we forked their work back into ours. So it went both ways, and arguably they were a bit more successful.
Fascinating. Thanks, David. And Liz, like, how are you thinking about creating a business around open source?
Yeah, I think there's some really important distinctions here, because there's a bit of a culture around the idea that people should just be able to write software in, sit in their bedroom, write an amazing piece of code, and that somehow magically money will appear. And I think it's really important that if people are serious about writing an open source business, they're not just thinking about, I'm going to create a popular project and then magic will happen. I think being a little bit more intentional about why it's open source, what it is that you're going to use to have a business model around that, is really important. I'm working now in a business that always started with the idea of the core technology is open source, but there will be enterprise users who, want somebody on the hook. They want a contract, and maybe they also want some features that, you only need when you get to the kind of scale that means you've got money. So it's certainly very possible to have a business that is centered around open source, but I do think it's very important not to assume that all you need to do is write some code and get people to use it, and then the money will follow. There's a huge...
Usually it's the other way around. You spend the money, then you write the code.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge array of, failed companies where they didn't really think through how the business was going to make, and I've been responsible for one. So, I can hold my hand up to that. I wish we had thought through more about how the money would, be generated, and how we were going to add value that people would pay for, or companies would pay for.
That's true. I'd also say that when we were looking at it in the phases before that, like, a lot of those business models hadn't actually started to evolve in some ways. We didn't have the experience to know actually what type of business model might work, like, and actually setting out, as David said, just writing some code and just seeing it succeed. Like, it's not, if you've done that, if you start with the code first, and I noticed you mentioned you should start with a business model in mind first. But in that particular case, as it was in my open source project with, well, not mine, but the company, Cert Manager and Cube Lego, we did it just because we were scratching an itch. We saw an issue that we were trying to solve for a customer. We open sourced it. We didn't think anything of it. We thought maybe there might be a chance to monetize this in the future, but we weren't actually thinking about that sort of business model in advance, as it were. Alexis, did you think, like, very carefully about that business model with Rabbit and then with Weaveworks in advance, and how did you envisage it sort of progressing?
With Rabbit, we basically duplicated the business model that was coming into fashion in 2006, 7, 8, which was consulting, support, and then an ambition to do a product over the top, or maybe a cloud service. We actually did launch a cloud service just before we got acquired by VMware. And I was intrigued to see that just recently Cloud AMQP, which did their own Rabbit MQ cloud service a few years later, is going strong, and just published some very impressive user stats. They've got a very large number of users of their Rabbit cloud service. I'm very happy for them. But the idea of doing a cloud service to monetize an open source business was very, very new in 2006 or 7, because EC2 had only just landed to prove that you could do cloud at all. And when we got into VMware, nobody wanted to do a cloud service based on RabbitMQ because it was VMware, and they were still trying to figure out which way to go in this new market. But we got to that because I first, after doing the experience with Metalogic and MySQL, I looked at Spring Source, and they were doing, it wasn't even called Spring Source then, they were doing consulting with JBoss model. So was Ross with SymphonySoft. It wasn't called MuleSoft then. And so was James with ActiveMQ. And I thought, well, nobody's providing systematic support at scale for these software layers. We could do a support only open source business. And I worked with some investors and some people to build a whole business model for open source support called OpenCare, which we thought about trying to raise money for, and then managed to find some people to work with. And then just realized that the basic problem with it is that the economics don't work very well.
Yeah.
And certainly in 2005, 6, 7, there weren't nearly enough people and businesses flowing money through that. And even today, Tidelift are doing the same business model. Those are very sophisticated people. The person who's running is the person who created the original Red Hat Enterprise Linux business. They're absolutely the right person to solve this. But it's very difficult to get money to flow through to open source contributors in this way, because you spend so much just making sales, marketing, and support work. There's not much left to give out to contributors. So you end up hiring a bunch of permanent developers because it's cheaper to have FTEs than pay people bits and pieces. So once you've realized this, then you realize it makes much more sense to have your own product. That's when you think, okay, we'll have the trademark, we'll have the business, we'll have the project all in one house. That was the model. And then you have the Spring Source model, the JBoss model, what became the MuleSoft model, and everybody did the same thing for a few years. And we were the first group of companies to really come through, other than MySQL and Red Hat, that could make money out of having a consolidated set of consultant support and products around OSS. So that was, I call that kind of phase 2 of open source, really, because the first phase was the 90s and the sort of life and death of all the Linux companies, except for a few. So that was the second phase, is realizing you could have a point solution. But the difficulty was scaling it beyond about 30 million of revenue, which other companies that didn't get acquired try to do. It was very, very difficult without proprietary software.
So I'm hearing you say is that in order to actually build a successful company based on open source software, you're likely going to have a proprietary product to go with it.
If you want to, if you want to make revenue over $100 million in a world where people are competing with you, including hyperscale cloud providers and very large established vendors, you've got to be able to grow revenues 2 or 3 times a year. That means you've got to have a subscription that can be renewed. You've got to have sticky revenues, which
and
only
if it's
works.
Just support or services, it's because obviously a lot of, from what I've seen through the history of working for companies and being in sales in the early days of those companies, support will work for a year or two as companies are getting their head around the software and they need the support. But actually, once they got to a point where they understand it and they know how to use it, it's less easy to then get them to renew.
People move around and things change. So with the support and consulting model, when the buyer's team changes, someone else comes along and says, why are we spending money on this? Whereas with the proprietary software model, someone else comes along and says, oh no, we don't understand this. I guess we'll have to carry on paying for it then. So it's a totally different renewal dynamic. And that's why if you look at what investors look at now, they're interested in things like net dollar retention, which is a measure of how much positive churn you have in each account. And it's got to be over 110% in order to build a sustainable open source business.
David, Liz, do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I do. I think, it very much sort of ties in with what I was saying about thinking about your business model. You might not get it right. You might not know exactly, but I think you have to, particularly if you're trying to raise money, have a plausible understanding of, to tell your investors, if they spend money on your team, how is that money going to get paid back? And I think it's a very, very big ask. And David, as someone who invests, may have a different opinion or the same opinion. But I think it's a very big ask to say, we're just going to build this software and then see where that takes us because we think it'll be popular. I think understanding, are you going to aim to be a product company, even if you don't know exactly what that product is, like you did with JetStack, or are you going to be a services company and how is that going to scale? Or I guess, are you going to? And I really don't think we should discount the idea of successful bootstrap businesses that don't ever raise,
Yeah, absolutely.
VC money. There are lots of different approaches. They don't all have to be $100 million revenue, but if you are aiming for that kind of scale, you're going to have to think about how that money's going.
And on that, myself and my business partner Matt, we didn't take any funding. We actually started with services and just saw that as a potential stepping stone. Actually, once you get into the sort of like the service model, it is then quite difficult to think about how you then step into building an engineering team, and because you kind of get used to a bit of the revenue coming through. But yeah, there was a chance that JetStack could have continued. I mean, obviously we ended up exiting ourselves, but we could have continued for the next 20 years as a very happy, profitable, service company. So yeah, I totally, I can totally see that point of view, Liz. David, anything to add on that from your perspective?
The reason why multiples for subscription software businesses are significantly higher than businesses with services as their prime revenue, and that's because of the margins. To scale services, which includes consulting and support, you have to have people, and people are expensive. Whereas you can scale a software business sometimes for free, or at least effectively for free. Obviously, it's not free. As you scale up, it's expensive to scale, but relative to paying for people. And that's why we've seen most of the open source businesses and generally most software businesses move to subscription models, because you've got guaranteed revenue.
Yeah.
And if you can get customers renewing, if they're happy, then it just grows into the future and you don't even have to do anything. Certainly for a while anyway. Obviously there's competition, so it makes it hard to not do anything, but essentially that business will just keep renewing every single year and you can grow it, and it's much more valuable as a company that way.
Yeah. Talking, obviously thinking about a proprietary product on top of an open source foundation, I guess, or project, how successful do you think the open source project has to be before you start thinking about building do you have to have thousands of GitHub stars or loads of contributors and huge traction in the open source to make it successful? Is that just part of the deal? If you want to have a successful business built on top of open source software, that open source software has to be really popular and spreading like wildfire, or do you think it's possible to build a business on a piece of open source software that maybe people don't really know that much about?
I would say you could do both, but I think the key to the business aspect is people don't want to run software. It's a generalization, but really you want to avoid running your own software as much as possible. You don't want to run any databases, you don't want to run any infrastructure, you want to pay someone else to do that for you because it's really difficult. And you get to the point where you're having to run your own stuff because you hit scale. Either way, it's too expensive to pay someone else, or the scale is so large that you have to do it yourself. And that's where you get the value added of someone else coming in to assist you with that particular thing, which is why we see everyone moving to the hyperscale clouds, because no one wants to run their own data center and rack servers. And it's the same why developers love serverless, because they don't have to deal with dealing with databases and installing them, updating them, all that kind of stuff, and dealing with scaling when they're suddenly on the front page of Hacker News and they've got tens of thousands of people visiting their site within a few minutes. And just paying someone else to deal with that is a real luxury compared to what we used to have to do. That changes a bit as you get into real scale, and you can start to extract components and then run them yourself where you have a differentiator. Like Netflix runs mostly on AWS, but they run their own content delivery network because that's at such a scale where they want to optimize it and run it themselves. But I think being able to solve a pain point for a business where the business doesn't want to do that themselves is where you add the value on top of the infrastructure. And the value of the open source bit is once you get to the point where you're at a certain scale or you're having certain problems, you can take the software and run it yourself.
Can I follow up on that thing about the number of stars? And
yeah,
so first of all, I mean, I do think GitHub stars is a gameable metric, so it's very dangerous to associate too much emphasis on it. But the broader point of is your project popular? Are people using it? Are they engaged with it? I think that can be an extraordinarily valuable asset. It's something that you can leverage. You can use that community who are interested in your project as if they really love it, they will be ambassadors for what you're doing, at least for that project. But I still think it comes back to, you can't necessarily expect those people to they're not all going to pay. I think there's, again, this dangerous idea of, we've got 10,000 people who like our project. So, if 1% of them pay $100 a month, why? Why are they going to do that?
Pencils in China business model.
Talk us through that analogy.
Well, it's there's billions of people in China. We'll sell them all, rubbers that go on pencils, and then we'll make, a fraction of a fraction. Therefore, we're going to be billionaires overnight. If you look at the actual numbers for open source projects, they tend to be very, very low indeed, even with very successful commercial companies. So for every 100 people using an open source project in production, probably fewer than 5% might become customers. It varies a lot from project to project. Something like Linux, the whole thing is kind of designed to make it difficult to pay for support in the first place. So you end up with something like Red Hat, where you're paying for scale, really, and different people in a large organization using it in different ways. That's why they sell a secure bitstream rather than a product, rather than a closed source product. With tools like MongoDB, you might see slightly higher percentages though. And obviously there are companies that have built strategies by having broken open source projects, which then you're sort of forced to buy something. And you can get that very wrong. I don't want to name names, but one company made this flip-flop between their open source, between the HA being proprietary and pay for, which once you've done it a couple of times really, really damages you. I think for the community is really, really important, but they're almost like a kind of people who are following a music band. So, it sometimes helps to think about your open source project as like a music band. So the first album needs to be successful and makes your mark, but doesn't make very much money. And then there's a sort of second or third album. The third album
difficult second album. Oh.
Difficult second album. That's when you turn it into a company. And then the third and fourth album is where you're sort of figuring out that you're going to be around for a few more years. So you better start making middle of the road pop. Otherwise, no one's going to pay you. So, this is how things change. And that's very important. The other thing, going back to the point about cloud and what David was saying, is I think it really helps to think about open source being a form of self-service. So, a lot of the user dynamics are, I want to do my own thing. I want to self-serve my solutions as cheaply as possible, preferably free. And then as I sort of start to use them more in anger, I'm going to worry less about the details. And that's when I'm going to pay for someone else to look after that piece for me. So that's why it's really essential that you choose the right surface area of your product or project for somebody to pay for. Otherwise, it won't be big enough for them to care about. And if it's too big, they'll never use your product. So that's why things like Certificate Manager can be successful. It's like, it seems small, but it's actually quite important, right? So if it was any bigger, nobody would have trusted you because you were JetStack.
Yeah.
And we have the same issue. All startups have this. I'm not singling you out, but if you're doing a new thing, it really helps if you've got that kind of easy in, but then it becomes more important over time, and that allows you to build a self-service construct around it, which usually starts with something like support services.
Yeah, and it amazes me. Sometimes we're contacted by banks that I didn't know were using Cert Manager, and they've had an issue with Cert Manager, or a cert they'd not renewed, and before you knew it, they know a banking platform was down. So we still get those those people contacting.
Banks hate that. We have banking customers who just care a lot about CVEs, critical vulnerability exceptions, and they will use software if it has no CVEs, and if we as a company can promise that we'll take CVEs out, patch and fix software very fast.
Yeah.
By very fast, I mean before they've been told there's a problem, usually is how they like to know. You find out there's a problem, we've already got a patch. And that's where some of the business models, it has to be the right kind of software. But if it's running in their critical systems, they will.
Well, we saw it with Log4j clearly recently as well. So Yeah, there is a. I've got a question here in the background from Philippe Ensoge. I think he's sounds like he's an advisor, and he's saying that as an advisor, he's often asked their startups they advise to be 100% committed in time and soul in their project in order to be successful. Is it the same in creating open source software projects? I'm assuming, or does it take that time, effort, and commitment to create a successful open source project, or can it be done, in your spare time, perhaps, to sort of and just see how it
I
goes
think this whole idea of doing things in spare time is pretty far-fetched. I mean, people can't do things in their spare time forever. No, you can have part-time projects. Many open source projects are very successful and are part-time. I think it's when it shifts over to becoming a company that enterprise customers use that it can be a full-time thing. But it doesn't have to be. I mean, not everything has to be a VC-backed Datadog or something like that.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of examples of successful projects that were never a business and were always a part-time thing, a weekend project or something. But I think the maintainers of those projects have to be extraordinarily careful about how they set expectations and how they kind of engage with the community, because when people start using their software, I saw actually a really good blog post or Twitter thread about this just last night, about the kind of the expectations that, oh, I can use this software, but if something goes wrong with it, people are stressed and I've got a bug, it's creating a problem for me, and they try and get that problem solved by someone who isn't being paid for it and maybe has their own stresses to deal with.
I have to say that this is an area where people often kind of get things a bit round the twist. It's like, they start by thinking, well, it'd be great if we got paid to fix these bugs.
Yeah.
But actually what happens is if you have a support contract, what you're doing is giving somebody permission to hassle you indefinitely about the fact the bug's not been fixed.
Absolutely.
Whereas if it's a part-time project and expectations have been set correctly, as you suggest, you can say to people, go away, it's the weekend.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Because if you don't manage that kind of expectation, or you're not prepared to say no, or sorry, not today, it's a huge recipe for burnout. And it's why people get so disillusioned about their open source projects and like, why isn't no one paying me? Well, you didn't make it clear that that's what you needed to provide that support. And it goes even further than that. We see vulnerabilities, where maintainers have said, I'm stepping back, does anybody want to take over? Yeah, I'm happy, says malicious coder who wants to insert a vulnerability.
You'd say it in jest, but actually that is a real cause for concern, especially as open source becomes so much more popular, because when I started out, like all of the attack vectors were on Internet Explorer and Microsoft Windows and Outlook. But now, obviously you look at the success of open source software, like actually does that then become a possible target for these attackers? Yeah,
everything's a target in IT.
It is.
But just going back to the why should I get paid thing, I want to bring up the music analogy again. It's very hard to make money from music. Very few musicians do. Those that do are often not talented, they're just lucky, or vice versa. Very talented people can be in the wilderness for a long time or play music with their band at the weekends, and that's a good thing to do. So I think that you just need to understand that without communities of free consumption and production, some things just wouldn't exist at all. And you can't just assume that just because it's possible to do something for free, but it's also possible to do the same thing for money. It just doesn't follow.
Yeah. David, any comments on this topic?
I think it probably highlights how little people read those open source licenses, because it often says in capital letters, no warranty provided as is. And that's just something very simple to point to. If you're producing something, throw it up, and people are asking for stuff, you just point them to the line in the license. But no one reads licenses, so it's not surprising.
No, exactly. And I same thing. Obviously, that was in our license, but in our open source projects, there was a big disclaimer saying this is not meant for production use. And 3 months later, at the first KubeCon, after open sourcing it, I meet dozens of companies using it in production. So yeah, it's still clearly happens. But actually, what I found is it actually, although sometimes like the actual people behind the open source projects can feel a little bit daunted or trapped by the success of the project itself, because like to your point before, there's the stress of like people contacting you to try and ask for fixes, and it can become a bit of a bind for people. And I know many people who've ended up spending sleepless nights or working on projects all evening for no money whatsoever, just because they felt they needed to do it. Whereas I've met other open source software project maintainers who've like been able to kind of separate that line and just sort of switch off from it and ignore. But I think that is one thing that I think potential founders need to consider.
Other aspect of this is sometimes there are cases where there are open source projects and someone else monetizes them.
Yeah.
Because the originator doesn't actually want to be in that line of work at all. They're just happy doing what they're doing for whatever reason.
Well, and that's a great segue to the next question, which is what would you say the big downsides of starting a business around open source software is? I mean, we've explored some of them, perhaps, like that sort of competitive nature, like sometimes the inability maybe to monetize some of those particular open source projects. Anything else that you've learned in the course of doing business in the space that you kind of maybe wish that you hadn't?
I mean, I think there are best practices now, and as there are with any tech business, and there's investors in this country and others who've been through this many times. And if you're thinking about any business, it really helps to work with people who've done it lots of times before. So that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. In terms of specific negatives about open source, one of the negatives at the moment is I think investors are perhaps slightly starry-eyed about it, and expectations can get set a little bit higher than they should be, mm-hmm. Which is always a problem down the road. And I think that's a big thing to think about.
Thanks, Alexis. Liz?
Trying to think about issues that are specific to open source rather than sort of general, I suppose one is that, kind of following on from what we were saying about support, it's pretty easy to get distracted. What's good for your project and what's good for your business, mm-hmm. trying to keep those two things aligned and making sure that you're not, what is it, feeding Peter to rob Paul, I think that might be the saying, that you get the balance right between sustaining your community users and keeping your business successful.
You have just like reminded me of a point in time when we were doing a certain amount of professional services and training and some support, and we had to decide whether we were going to commit some of that time to furthering the open source project, which was Cert Manager, or continuing to use our internal team to sell more day rate consultancy. And we had to make that difficult decision because we were right on a knife edge, and we decided to commit to the open source project, which obviously was the right thing to do, but it was a really, really difficult decision because the dynamics around, whether you could make money from the open source project or not, weren't that clear. And thankfully we did, and we've gone on to do that, but it wasn't an easy thing. Decision to make. So yeah, I can totally empathize with that as well. David, anything from you?
I think there's a tension between them because open source is socialist and business is capitalist, and those, when you combine them, tend to have problems. So you have to think about what the relationship is between the business that is supporting the open source and vice versa. I think the way that a lot of companies have tackled that is by making the features that businesses want to pay for the proprietary element and keeping that out of the open source project. But then equally, you can see companies running open source as the exact same code base that they're running in production in their cloud services. And the value is just that, well, we'll run it for you because we're the experts. But there's always a tension between, well, what features do you put in open source versus the cloud? How do you support that? Which internal people are dedicated to working on what? How do you justify it from a business perspective? And it's clearly been done many times by many successful companies, public companies, as well as smaller businesses. It's just, you have to think about that, and there's always going to be a tension just because the philosophies are so different.
That's, great points, David. There's a question here that's just popped up in the chat. So there's not directed to anyone specifically, but obviously in traditional enterprise businesses, so I'm assuming proprietary there, the company would try and capture paying customers through sales teams, going out and calling on the customer to try and get into the door. So this person's saying that that would obviously provide a higher barrier to leaving and switching to another product. And so in open source, what are some of the strategies to capture and keep open source users, I guess customers, engaged in the longer term? Like, is it harder to move once
really good to hide bugs deep in the code? Tell people that after they've adopted it 3 years later, and you've got them absolutely over barrel. No, just kidding. Don't do that. I would say that you mentioned salespeople. I mean, one of the things we used to talk about was how in open source completely inverts the software model.
Mm-hmm.
So a traditional company like Microsoft or Oracle in the 90s would have an R&D team building the product in the middle of a dartboard, concentric circles, surrounded by, product, then marketing, then sales, then, I mean, the outer circle is people whose only job is to meet people and talk to them about what's going on in the middle. And so to actually get to the people in the middle, you have to go through all of these layers. And if you ever try to arrange a meeting with the Microsoft, team working on a product, you know what that was like in the 90s. It takes a year. Now it's all changed. So actually, the people on the outside are the techies interacting through community models. This is certainly true in infrastructure. You can meet Microsoft lead developers like Brendan Burns easily on Twitter or at conferences or in GitHub. And he's very happy to interact with people, as are many others, for instance. And it's only when you actually get to the point of commitment that you sort of run into sort of sales, products, and cloud services at the middle of the business. So stickiness comes from getting to that middle. So it really is about what is the way of making the customer happy. Doesn't come from the things on the periphery. Those are all basically how you interact with something in the first place. But once people have moved on, the business has got a different team on an application, maybe they've adopted the product in other places, it's really, really important that your organization feels comfortable to continue to work with you. And that's one of the main reasons why people start open source businesses, because you can have a relationship between two businesses, but it's quite hard for a business to have a relationship with a project.
I want to add in some experiences from before I was at Isovalent. I was at Aqua, where I led our open source engineering team. Now, Aqua is essentially a proprietary software company, but we used open source. We built a bunch of open source tools that are complementary, sort of adjacent to what the proprietary software was. And it was, they're useful tools in their own right, like any other kind of open source project. Loads of people using tools like KubeBench because they're useful, and there was no upgrade path from that project, using that project to some kind of commercial offering. But what it meant was people were somewhat familiar with us. So the sales people whose jobs are essentially about relationship building, when they kind of contact, they have like an address book of, people that they've sold to in the past, and they'd call them up and say, hey, I'm working with Aqua now. And the people that they're talking to go, oh yeah, we're using some of their software. And it immediately gives you that kind of warm entry for the, they've already got a relationship with the open source software.
Permission-based selling.
Yeah. And I would say we went from a sales team that were quite skeptical about, like, why are we giving software away, to, oh, we love what the open source team is doing because it gives us, like you say, the permission to engage, the permission to talk about some of the other things that we do.
But implicit in that is also the idea that salespeople want to talk to somebody different from the end users, which is really key when you have an ancillary business. And the typical ancillary business that I've seen working a lot recently is scale and governance. This is essentially what HashiCorp do. GitLab's the same. It explicitly says on their website, you should buy GitLab EE because we create features here, the Enterprise Edition. We assume sort of roughly 100 seats of GitLab users. And their belief, which I think is proven correct, is that once you get to that scale, the customer has a different set of needs. You no longer have the direct contact and empathy between the tools, the developers, and the team, which is critical at the individual and small team adoption point when productivity matters a lot. And instead, you've got multiple teams using the same tool. And so other issues are arising, like how do I keep people from tripping over each other's repos in the case of GitLab? So scale governance as an ancillary product, you will end up, the salespeople will have permission to talk to procurement about buying an enterprise-wide license. And that's a very good place for them to be, as you say, Liz.
Yeah, often the person who writes the check is not the same person as the person who's actually using the tool, at the command line. But they may ask their opinion. 20 years ago, nobody asked developers an opinion. But as we all know now, the developer is king.
Yeah.
Their opinion does matter. Yeah.
The other thing just to bear in mind is obviously with open source, very often you're not tracking who's using it, so you don't really know who is actually using it. So it's hard to get hold of or understand. So I'm sure that we're running out of time now, but like that's something to bear in mind is how do you get to know who your users are? I think is one that I've always struggled with, or I've struggled with for a long time. David, any final comment on that before we wrap up with a final question?
I think that's a very important point, that developers as individuals almost never pay for software. It's the business that's paying for the software that developers use. And you have to think about who's the buyer and who's the user. And the user has so much more influence these days, and they're sometimes making evaluations and then just going through a purchasing department. But sometimes the buyer is just someone completely different. And developers have a lot of choice. So making sure that developer experience and kind of focusing on that and how that leads into the sale is key for the adoption of any software product these days.
It's a great point to finish. Thanks, David. So last question, just to wrap up. If you're going to give one piece of advice to someone who's about to start a business in the open source space, what would you give them? What advice would you give them? Liz, we'll start with you. Hopefully not putting you on the spot.
I get the easy
there.
Yeah. Talk to people. I think particularly for those of us who are engineers, we have a tendency to go, I can solve the problem by typing things into my keyboard. Actually, it turns out you learn an awful lot by engaging with other people who've been there and done that. So I think that's why I was excited about doing this Founders Forum, because hopefully people will reach out, get involved and use us as sounding boards, and hopefully our experience can be useful.
Thank you for mentioning that, because that was going to be my next point. openuk.uk/founders forum. You can sign up there. But yeah, I'm totally with you on that. David?
I think putting thought into a project up front, whether it's something you want to create as a business or open source, I think is how I would do things differently this time. It's a lot easier to start more restrictive and gradually open up over time as you realize who your users are, who might pay for it, or just whether you're just having fun at the weekends. And a lot of the controversy today is when companies take something away, whether it's a free service that you've used for a long time, or whether it's a feature or a change in license or something like that. If you're adding restrictions, that it tends to go down badly. If you're opening something up, that tends to be people are a lot happier.
Yeah, and having gone through a process of being acquired by a proprietary cybersecurity company, the concern around what they could do with Cert Manager or the projects we've created, and like whether that was going to be affected. Fortunately, they backed us to sort of and supported us in keeping open source. But yeah, that is something you have to, people should definitely bear in mind. Thanks, David. And Alexis, final word from you on this?
I would say it's really important to form a team. For any of these things, to start with more than one person, where you have clear roles and sit down together and discuss what is the expectation for this thing in 2 or 3 years' time, because it will take at least that time to get anywhere useful.
Indeed, it does. Thank you so much to all my panelists. Really great discussion. I really enjoyed it. I hope the participants did too. Please come back next week, same time, where we talk about product market fit. And a big thanks to Open UK for organising all of the media to go with it, and Stephen, who's behind the scenes managing it. Thank you so much. Have a great Friday afternoon and weekend.